At the inheritance hearing, all parties will remain silent while I review this final document. The judge's voice bounced off the paneled walls, but all I could see was my father 3 chairs away grinning like he'd already won. Dad sat with his shoulders back, one arm around the young woman at his side, the one he proudly called his pregnant mistress. She rested a manicured hand on her belly, as if the child inside already owned everything my mother had worked for. Out in the hallway, he'd said it loud enough for the whole waiting area to hear. "After today, sweetheart, our baby might own half this town." I hadn't answered. I just watched him walk past me without a glance. His only child. The daughter he was trying to push out of the picture. Then my lawyer stood up and lifted the envelope. "Your Honor," he said, steady and clear, "the DNA results are here." The room went very still. The fluorescent lights hummed. The mistress's fingers tightened on Dad's sleeve. Dad turned toward my lawyer with that little smirk I knew too well, the one that said, "I always land on my feet." The judge motioned for the envelope. My lawyer crossed the room, placed it in his hand, and sat down beside me. I could hear my heartbeat while the judge slid on his reading glasses and unfolded the papers. No one else in that courtroom knew what was coming. But I did. Because I'm the one who ordered that test. A few years earlier, my life had looked very different. I was still living in the same small Midwestern town where I'd grown up, a place with one main street, a Walmart by the highway, and more churches than stop signs. I worked the front desk at the clinic. Most mornings I drove past my mother's house, the little blue one with the white porch and the maple tree that turned red every fall. Even after she was gone, that house still felt like hers. Her death cracked the world open. Lung cancer took her faster than anyone expected. I watched her shrink into her favorite recliner while the TV murmured. At night I slept on the couch so I could help her to the bathroom or steady her when the pain hit. Dad was rarely there. He always had something to do: church meetings, errands, a men's group. Sometimes he came home smelling like someone else's perfume. I noticed. I just didn't have the strength to argue. By the time we buried her, there was already a new friend from church. He introduced the woman at the funeral. She stayed near the back pew, hair perfect, eyes too calm. When our eyes met, she gave me a small, practiced smile. A few weeks later, the envelopes began to arrive: Mom's will bank summaries, notices from a probate attorney. I wasn't thinking about inheritance. I was still burning casseroles because I kept forgetting to set the timer. But Dad suddenly had plenty to say. "I'm sure your mother wanted to make sure I'm taken care of," he said one evening at the old kitchen table. "After all I did for her." He started talking about simplifying things, selling Mom's rental duplex near the high school, maybe selling the house. "You don't want to be stuck with old buildings and repairs," he said. "Let me handle it. We can cash out while the market's decent." "Did Mom say she wanted that?" I asked. He shrugged. We talked. You know how she worried. Once I might have nodded and dropped it. But a few months earlier, when Mom was first diagnosed, she'd called me into her bedroom. She'd taken my hand and shown me her will. "I just want you to have somewhere that's yours," she'd told me. "If everything else falls apart, you'll still have a roof." I remembered the way her fingers squeezed mine when she said it. So, instead of nodding now, I called the number on one of the legal envelopes and made an appointment with the estate attorney listed at the bottom. That's how I met Mark. He looked more like a retired teacher than a lawyer, late 50s, thinning hair, coffee mug that said, "Best grandpa ever." A photo of 3 grandkids sat behind his desk. He let me tell the story: Mom's illness, Dad's absences, the friend from church, the talk about selling everything. I slid a folded copy of Mom's will across his desk, the one she'd shown me, the one I'd quietly photographed. He read in silence for a minute. "Your mother left the house and the rental property to you," he said at last. "Your father was named executor until you reached a certain age. You're past that now. He can't legally sell those assets without your consent." I felt something loosen in my chest and tighten at the same time. "So if he's trying to push me?" "You don't sign anything you don't understand," Mark said. "And you don't let anyone rush you. Grief and money bring out sides of people we'd rather not see." On the drive home, the sky hung low over the fields. For the first time since her funeral, I felt more than just sadness. I felt responsibility. Over the next year, Dad turned into a man I barely recognized. New car, new clothes, different women on his arm at church. At family gatherings, he joked that I was too soft for the real world and called me our little bleeding heart. People chuckled. I smiled tightly and filed every word away. Whenever I asked about estate papers, he brushed me off. "Why can't you just trust me?" he'd say. "You're not built for this." But quietly, with Mark's help, I began to learn exactly what I was built for. I didn't yet know that the road we were on would end in that courtroom with a mistress clutching her belly, a sealed envelope in my lawyer's hand, and a judge about to read words that would drain the color from my father's face. All I knew was that my mother had trusted me with the truth, and I was finally ready to fight for it. If there's one thing I've learned in small-town America, it's this: nothing spreads faster than a funeral rumor, except a rumor about money. By the time the inheritance hearing finally rolled around, nearly everyone in town had heard some version of the story. Depending on which coffee shop you sat in, people whispered that Dad was about to inherit a fortune, or that he was fighting his deadbeat daughter in court, or my favorite, that he was expecting a new baby at nearly 65. I didn't correct any of it. Let people talk. They always talked anyway. But nothing prepared me for the show Dad put on the morning of the hearing. I pulled into the courthouse parking lot early, hoping to sit in the hallway, breathe, and collect myself. I still had that old instinct, the one that told me to make myself small, quiet, easy. Years of living around Dad will do that to you. But as I stepped through the courthouse doors, my breath caught. Dad wasn't just here. He had brought an audience. He strutted into the lobby wearing his favorite charcoal sport coat, hair slicked back, a smile stretched so wide it showed every capped tooth he'd bought after Mom died. And on his arm, clinging to him like a prom date, was her. The Mistress. She was younger than I remembered, or maybe she just dressed younger. Tight sweater dress heels too high for a courthouse, hair curled like she was auditioning for a soap opera. One hand rested dramatically on her stomach, as if she were posing for a maternity magazine. Dad laughed too loudly at something she whispered, then looked around to make sure people noticed them. When his eyes landed on me, they didn't soften. Not even a flicker of recognition, just that smug, polished smile. "Well, if it isn't my daughter," he said, as if greeting a distant cousin. "You're early, that's surprising." The Mistress giggled and pressed closer to him. "Hi, sweetheart," she said to me, her tone dripping with condescension. "We've heard so much about you." I didn't answer. My lawyer Mark had coached me, do not take the bait. But Dad didn't need me to react. He wanted an audience, and the courthouse hallway delivered one. Every bench, every chair was lined with people waiting for their own cases, but all of them were watching us now. Dad thrived on that. "You know," he said loudly, patting the Mistress's belly, as if he were presenting a grand prize on a game show, "the Lord works in mysterious ways. Just when life seems to be winding down, he gives you something to live for." The Mistress placed a hand over her heart and looked up at him lovingly. "Our little miracle." My throat burned with something between anger and embarrassment. Not because of the baby, if it really existed, but because it was so painfully clear what he was doing. He wanted to humiliate me. He wanted the whole town to see him as a revitalized man with a new family, while I stood alone with my folders and quiet dignity. He leaned toward the couple sitting beside us, total strangers, and said with theatrical sadness, "My daughter hasn't been supportive, of course. Some people don't like sharing." The strangers looked uncomfortable. I felt myself swallow a small lump of shame I didn't deserve. Mark arrived just then, briefcase in hand. He nodded politely at Dad, who puffed his chest out like a bantam rooster. "Morning, everyone," my lawyer said calmly. "Isn't it a beautiful day?" Dad snorted, "Beautiful for some." The Mistress tightened her grip on his arm. "It'll be a very big day for our baby," she said. "Generational wealth changes everything." She said it like a line she'd practiced. I stiffened. Dad noticed. "Oh, did you not know?" he said, voice booming through the hallway. "My child, my future child, has just as much claim as you do. That's how real families work." A few heads turned. Someone whispered. I felt the sting of humiliation, sharp and familiar. He'd always known how to make me feel small with just a sentence, a glance, a smirk. Growing up, he perfected it like a craft. But this time something was different. His cruelty didn't land the way it used to. Maybe because I wasn't a scared teenager anymore. Maybe because my mother's signature on her will was burned into my memory. Or maybe because I knew what my lawyer had sealed in that plain white envelope tucked into his briefcase. The mistress took a step closer and lowered her voice so only I, Dad, and Mark could hear. "Don't take it too hard," she whispered, smiling sweetly. "Some women just aren't meant to be heirs. Or mothers." Dad chuckled. Mark shot her a sharp, disapproving look. "Classy," he murmured. Before she could respond, a bailiff opened the courtroom door. "Estate of Margaret Hall," he called. "Please step inside." Dad inhaled deeply and squeezed the mistress's waist. "Showtime," he said. As we walked into the courtroom together, but not together, I felt the old ache of family rupture, the kind that never fully heals. The wooden pews, the solemn seal above the judge's bench, the stale government air, it all felt too holy a place for the performance Dad was putting on. We took our seats. The judge entered. Dad straightened proudly, beaming like a man about to collect a lottery check. And that's when I knew with quiet certainty that the truth sitting in Mark's briefcase, the truth Dad didn't know was coming, would hit him harder than anything I could ever say. For once in my life, I didn't feel small. I felt ready. Part 2. The Pregnant Mistress and the Public Humiliation, 1028 words. Ban Jan Noi continue ChatGPT Jan Noi. Part 3. The Courtroom. Battle begins, 1001-50 words. When the judge finally settled into his seat, the entire room shifted into that heavy, disciplined silence you only feel in government buildings and church basements, the kind where every cough echoes and every whisper feels like a sin. Dad loved it. He sat, tall chin lifted, his hand resting possessively on the mistress's knee, as if presenting her to the judge as, "Exhibit a proof I deserve everything." I kept my eyes forward, hands folded neatly on the table. I could feel Mark's calm presence beside me, not loud, not flashy, just steady like the old oak trees that line Main Street. The judge flipped through the case file, pausing here and there. "This is a continuation of the estate matter regarding the late Margaret Hall," he said. "Today's goal is to clarify asset distribution and address objections raised by Mr. Hall." Dad gave a theatrical sigh, the kind only someone deeply committed to their own performance could pull off. "Yes, Your Honor," he said. "I'm here to make sure my late wife's wishes are honored." I almost laughed out loud. Mark didn't look at Dad nor at me. He simply adjusted his glasses the way he always did before letting someone talk themselves into trouble. The judge turned to Dad. "Your filings claim that certain assets, specifically the marital home and the rental duplex, should revert to you rather than transfer to your daughter." "That's correct," Dad said with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "My wife always believed in keeping the family secure. She said many times she wanted me in control of things." "And the will?" the judge asked. Dad shrugged as though the will were inconvenient paperwork. "My wife was very sick. You know how pain affects clarity. I believe she meant something different from what was written." I stiffened. Mark placed a steady hand on my forearm, a subtle reminder to stay composed. The mistress leaned forward, cleavage strategically visible, and whispered loudly enough for the microphones to pick it up. "Besides, Your Honor, there's a baby now. Family grows. Priorities shift." Dad nodded enthusiastically. "Exactly, my unborn child deserves protection too." The judge raised an eyebrow. "We will address that claim in due time." Dad beamed, mistaking patience for agreement. Mark cleared his throat. "Your Honor, before we proceed, I'd like to enter into record that the will was prepared by a licensed attorney and signed independently by Mrs. Hall while she was mentally competent. I have the medical assessments to confirm her full capacity at the time." He handed several documents to the bailiff. The judge skimmed them, nodding slowly. "This appears in order." Dad's jaw tightened. "But arrogance is a stubborn thing, it doesn't yield easily." He leaned forward, elbows on the table. "My daughter has had a difficult life," he said. "She's fragile, easily influenced. I worry the responsibility of managing property will overwhelm her. My guidance would honor her mother's intent." Fragile. The word hit me like a pebble, not a stone, not anymore. Something small, irritating, almost laughable. Mark responded gently. "Your Honor, my client has maintained employment, paid her own bills, and dealt responsibly with multiple legal documents over the past 2 years. She is neither fragile nor incapable. The issue here is simply respecting the written will." The judge nodded again. A crack formed in Dad's smile. That only made him push harder. My wife always said our daughter wasn't prepared for the real world, he said. She struggled in school, had trouble making friends, never stuck with anything. I tried my best to raise her, but... Enough, the judge said firmly. Dad blinked. The courtroom held its breath. This is a probate hearing, not a personal character evaluation. We are here to interpret the will and determine legality. Unless you can provide written evidence that your wife's stated wishes changed, we move forward with the document as signed. Dad opened his mouth, closed it, then shifted strategies. Well, Your Honor, he said, gesturing toward the mistress's belly. The real issue is fairness. If my daughter takes everything, that leaves nothing for my next child, a child who deserves their birthright. The mistress lifted her chin, playing her role perfectly. I waited. Mark waited. We both knew what was coming later, but letting Dad dig his own hole was a strange kind of satisfaction, quiet, steady revenge. The judge folded his hands. At this point, the unborn child's rights depend entirely on paternity and applicable state law. This claim has been vigorously disputed by the petitioner. The mistress piped up, There's no dispute, he's the father, he's always been. Mark finally spoke, voice calm as a lake. Your Honor, we will address the paternity matter shortly. Dad glared at him, then at me, as if I had conjured the universe out of spite. The judge turned pages. Mr. Hall, there also appears to be an issue with financial management. Several accounts show large withdrawals under your signature with funds unaccounted for. You were executor at the time. Dad looked stunned genuinely for once. Those were normal expenses, he said quickly. Home repairs, bills. A man can't be expected to remember every detail. Mark slid a folder onto the table. Your Honor, we have itemized statements and contractor testimony indicating no such repairs occurred. Additionally, multiple withdrawals coincide with casino charges. The mistress stiffened. Dad shot her a warning look. I watched silently, not with glee, though a touch of that flickered through me, but with something heavier. This was the man who raised me. The man who laughed at my school awards and told me not to get a big head. The man who bought new furniture when Mom needed chemo. He had spent years perfecting the role of the aggrieved father, but the mask was cracking. The judge removed his glasses and rubbed the bridge of his nose. This case is quickly becoming more complicated than a simple will review, he said. We will take a short recess before proceeding with paternity questions. Dad rose confidently as if he still believed he could spin this. But as the bailiff called for recess, I noticed something new in his eyes, not confidence. Fear. For the first time in my life, my father looked small, and we hadn't even opened the envelope yet. When the bailiff announced the recess, Dad rose like a man preparing for a parade instead of a legal inquest. He straightened his jacket, smoothed his thinning hair, and escorted the mistress toward the hallway with all the swagger of a small-town mayor. She clung to him, smiling brightly, whispering little reassurances he seemed desperate to hear. Mark and I stayed in our seats. He leaned over, lowered his voice, and said, He's rattled. You just can't see it yet. I exhaled slowly. My hands trembled, not with fear, but with the kind of anticipation that coils deep in your bones when truth is about to walk into the room. He still thinks he has control, I murmured. Mark nodded. Arrogance is predictable. It always forgets to look behind itself. We sat quietly for a moment. The judge was in chambers reviewing the will again, the bailiff leaning against the side wall, the hum of the fluorescent lights filling the room like static. My eyes drifted to the judge's bench, the same place where minutes from now Dad's future would pivot. I thought about my mother, the way she had squeezed my hand the day she showed me her will, how her voice cracked when she said she didn't trust Dad to handle the estate alone, how she whispered, "Promise me you'll stand up for yourself when the time comes." I had promised. I just never imagined the time would look like this, with a pregnant mistress in a skin-tight dress, a father twisting my mother's memory into something that suited his ego, and a secret envelope holding the power to tear down his entire performance. Ready, Mark asked. I nodded. Good, then let's finish this. When recess ended, the judge returned, expression composed but sterner than before. The courtroom filled again, Dad with renewed confidence, the mistress with her practiced gentle smile, and a few curious bystanders who seemed to sense that the juicy part was coming. "All right," the judge said, settling in. "Before we continue the financial matters, we need to address the paternity claim presented by Mr. Hall." The mistress lifted her chin proudly. Dad squeezed her hand. Mark rose. "Your Honor," he said, "as indicated earlier, my client has submitted documentation relevant to this matter. With the court's permission, we'd like to present it now." The judge motioned with his hand. "Proceed." Mark reached into his briefcase and withdrew the envelope, plain white, unassuming, and held it up like a relic. Dad laughed. Actually laughed. A dry, incredulous sound. "Oh, come on," he said. "What is this? Some stunt." "A test my daughter ordered because she's jealous of our family." The mistress stroked her stomach. "This is harassment," she whispered loudly enough for everyone to hear. Mark remained unbothered. "Your Honor, these are accredited laboratory results from a legally obtained paternity test." The judge held out his hand. "Bring it here." Dad leaned back, smirking. "Go on then, let's get this over with." Mark walked the envelope to the bench and placed it gently in the judge's palm. A hush fell over the courtroom. I felt my heartbeat in my ears. The judge tore the seal, took out the papers, and unfolded them. He read the first section, then the second. His expression shifted, not dramatically, but enough that the courtroom air seemed to tighten. Dad's smirk wavered. "Your Honor," he prompted. The judge looked up, fixing his gaze on the mistress first. "These test results," he said, "indicate a 0% probability of paternity." Silence. The mistress blinked. Dad frowned. "What does that mean?" The judge repeated, enunciating each word. "Mr. Hall is not the father of this child." The mistress's face drained of color. Dad turned to her slowly, like an old hinge resisting movement. "What is he talking about?" She opened her mouth, closed it, and then burst into tears, loud, dramatic sobs that echoed off the wooden pews. "It's wrong," she cried. "It has to be wrong. Those things aren't accurate. They mix up samples all the time." "They don't," Mark said gently, "not when chain of custody is properly documented." Dad shot to his feet. "You're lying, all of you." The judge held up a hand. "Sit down, Mr. Hall." "I won't sit down," Dad roared. "This is a setup, a conspiracy. My daughter has been out to destroy me for years." I stayed seated, calm. Dad's fury, so familiar, washed over me like background noise. "Your Honor," Mark said smoothly, "we would also like to submit Exhibit C security footage from the laboratory on the day of the test, confirming both her presence." He gestured to the mistress and the identity verification required before samples were taken. People in the pews turned to look at her. Dad stared at her with a stiff, twitching jaw. "You tell them the truth. Tell them this baby is mine." Her sobs quieted suddenly. She looked at him with a strange mixture of guilt and resentment. "You don't know what it's been like," she whispered. "He said he'd take care of me. You made promises too." "He," Dad shrieked. "Who is he?" She didn't answer. But she didn't have to. Mark whispered to me, "This is where arrogance finally sees itself." The judge cleared his throat. "Given this new evidence, the unborn child has no legal standing in this estate matter. Paternity fraud is a serious allegation, and the court will not entertain any further claims regarding this pregnancy." Dad slumped back into his seat as though something inside him had collapsed. His mistress looked away. And then, for the first time since I'd walked into the courthouse, Dad's eyes met mine, not with power, not with contempt, but with something raw and unfamiliar. Panic. The judge stacked the papers neatly and set them aside. "We will now continue with the inheritance proceedings," he said. "But first, Mr. Hall," he paused, "you will need to compose yourself." Dad inhaled sharply, chest trembling. The proud man who had strutted into the hallway an hour ago was gone, replaced by someone smaller, older, stripped bare. And all I felt was a quiet sadness. Not triumph. Not revenge. Just the truth settling into place the way truth always does, heavily, inevitably, without apology. Dad didn't look like himself anymore. The confident man who'd strutted into the courthouse with a mistress wrapped around his arm had evaporated. What sat before me now was someone smaller, someone shaken, someone who kept blinking like he couldn't quite believe the world had tilted under his feet. But the day wasn't done with him yet. The judge waited for the murmurs in the courtroom to settle. "We will now resume the matter of estate distribution," he said. "But given the previous executor's conduct, we must address irregularities in the financial records." Dad stiffened his fingers, trembling as they clutched the edge of the table. The mistress sat rigidly beside him, mascara streaking down her cheeks, but she still managed to lean away from him as though his disgrace might be contagious. Mark stood unhurried. "Your Honor, as we outlined in our filings, the financial documentation raises serious concerns. I'd like to walk the court through a few examples." He opened a thick binder, the pages crisp and neatly tabbed. Dad's copies of those same statements had shown up crumpled, coffee-stained, and suspiciously incomplete. Mark began with the first withdrawal. 2 months after Mrs. Hall's passing, he said Mr. Hall withdrew $10,000 from the joint estate account. Dad swallowed. "House repairs," he muttered, though no one had asked him yet. Mark raised a patient eyebrow. "We contacted every contractor in the county. No work orders, no estimates, no home visits." Dad gripped the table harder. "I paid cash," he said. "Small jobs, under the table." Mark nodded politely, flipping to another tab, and this second withdrawal, $12,000 a few weeks later. Dad's lips tightened. More house repairs. "And the next one?" "Garage repairs." "And the next?" "Roof repairs." Mark paused. "Interesting. Because the home inspector who evaluated the property just 8 months ago stated that the house hadn't seen recent repairs of any kind. In fact, he noted long-term neglect." The judge leaned forward. "Mr. Hall, do you have documentation for any of these repair expenses?" Dad rubbed his forehead. "I didn't keep them. Not everyone keeps receipts." Mark flipped to a printed email. "Your Honor, please note Exhibit F Mr. Hall's credit card statements. On the same days as these alleged repairs charges were made at Silver Star Casino in Wisconsin." A wave of soft gasps rippled through the courtroom. Dad shot up from his seat. "This is out of context," he yelled. "I'm allowed to have a little fun. My wife had died. How dare you judge how I coped?" The judge tapped his gavel lightly. "Sit down." Dad sank into his seat, face flushed. The mistress inched farther away. Mark continued gently, as though guiding a struggling student through a lesson. "Your Honor, this pattern continues for several months, large withdrawals coinciding with out-of-state casino trips, recreational spending, and hotel charges. All using estate funds during the period when Mr. Hall acted as executor." Dad tried to speak, but his voice came out hoarse. "I didn't know it wasn't clear. Lawyers make this stuff too complicated." "The law is very clear," the judge said sharply. "An executor is legally obligated to act in the best interest of the estate and its beneficiaries. Misuse of estate funds is a breach of fiduciary duty." I looked down at my hands. My palms were damp. Yes, the DNA revelation had rattled him. But this was the part that broke something inside him. For years, he'd built his life on pride and image. The respectable churchman, the devoted husband who had sacrificed for a difficult wife, the father burdened with a daughter who never made things easy. Now the mask was dissolving, and the truth underneath wasn't glamorous. It was reckless. Selfish. Lonely. Mark turned another page. "And then there's the matter of the rental property. Mr. Hall attempted to sell it without my client's consent or knowledge." "It was falling apart," Dad shouted. "I was trying to save her from a financial disaster." Mark didn't look rattled. "Odd," he said, "because the appraisal we obtained last spring valued the property at nearly $200,000. And records show Mr. Hall had already accepted a below-market offer cash only from an associate who owns multiple rental units near the high school." Dad slammed his fist on the table. "I needed money, all right. Is that what you want to hear? I was drowning. And she," he jabbed a finger toward me, "was too selfish to help." Something in me went still. Too selfish to help. After I had spent the last months of my mother's life sleeping on a couch beside her bed. After I had spent a year trying to honor the will she had shown me with trembling hands. After I had endured his cruelty, his neglect, his public humiliation. The judge exhaled. "Mr. Hall, this is deeply concerning. Given the misuse of estate funds, the attempt to sell property without authority, and the misleading statements you've made in this courtroom, I am considering sanctions." Dad sagged. For the first time he looked old, not older but old, the way a man looks when he realizes he can't bluff his way out of a hole he dug himself. He said quietly, voice cracking, I just needed a chance. Life hasn't been fair to me. The mistress rolled her eyes. Mark closed the binder. Your Honor, we believe that at this point the safe and lawful path is to remove Mr. Hall entirely from any remaining estate rolls and proceed with full transfer to my client as the will dictates. The judge nodded slowly. I agree. Dad let out a sound somewhere between a gasp and a whimper. And strangely my heart hurt for him. Not because he deserved sympathy, but because reality was catching up to him like a slow, cold tide, and he was a man completely unequipped to face it. This wasn't triumph. This was heartbreak in slow motion. The judge let the silence stretch, one of those deep courtroom silences that makes you feel like even the walls are holding their breath. Dad stared at the table as though the wood grain might offer him an escape route. The mistress, now visibly irritated, dabbed at her smeared mascara but didn't look at him, not once. I sat still, hands clasped tightly to keep them from shaking. Revenge doesn't always look like fireworks. Sometimes it looks like a quiet, inevitable settling of truth. The judge finally spoke. Mr. Hall, I've reviewed the will, the financial documents, and the evidence presented today. It is abundantly clear that your late wife intended her assets to go to her daughter. It is also clear you have repeatedly acted against that intent. Dad opened his mouth, but the judge lifted a hand. You mismanaged funds, attempted unauthorized sales, and misled this court. You also introduced a paternity claim that has now proven fraudulent. The mistress flinched at the word fraudulent. Dad pressed a hand to his forehead as though blindsided, though the facts had been creeping toward him all morning. The judge continued, voice steady but unyielding. Therefore, I am removing you from any involvement in this estate. You will repay the mismanaged amount as determined by the forensic accountant assigned to this case. And going forward, you are barred from making further claims against the estate. Dad's shoulders slumped as if someone had placed a heavy coat made of bricks across his back. This is absurd, he whispered. You're punishing me. Everything I did for my family. The judge's tone softened only slightly. Family is not defined by control, Mr. Hall, nor by intimidation, nor by deceit. A murmur rippled through the courtroom, those quiet communal sounds that come when people witness something painfully human. I felt a tightness in my throat. Then the judge turned to me. Ms. Hall, the estate will now transfer fully to you. I trust you will honor your mother's wishes responsibly. I nodded, unable to speak past the sudden swell of emotion. The relief wasn't triumphant, it was gentle, like finally putting down a heavy box you'd carried too far. Court is adjourned, the judge said. The gavel struck wood sharp and final. Dad didn't move. The mistress, however, moved quickly. She stood, gathered her purse, and walked right past him. No goodbye, no explanation. Just a stiff exit in her too high heels. A woman whose performance had ended the minute the spotlight dimmed. Dad didn't notice she was gone. He just sat there, hands trembling, staring at nothing. Most people began filing out, some whispering, others shaking their heads in sympathy or disbelief. I stayed seated, torn between wanting to flee and wanting to breathe in the moment. Mark packed his briefcase slowly. This was a long time coming, he said softly. Your mother would be proud. Proud. The word hit me in a place I didn't know was still raw. Thank you, I managed. He nodded and left to handle paperwork in the clerk's office, leaving me for the first time truly alone with my father. Dad finally lifted his gaze. His eyes looked puffy, unfocused, the way a man looks after losing a long, bitter fight he thought he'd win by default. You're happy now, he said hoarsely. The accusation wasn't sharp. It was tired, almost childlike. No, I said quietly, I'm not happy. Then, what do you want from me? His voice cracked. You've taken everything. I didn't take anything, I said. Mom left it to me. I'm just honoring that. He rubbed his temples. She always favored you. Always. I felt something twist inside me. Dad, she favored whoever showed up. I just happened to be there. He flinched. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The courtroom was nearly empty now, the echoes of footsteps fading down the hall. Outside the tall windows, the American flag flapped lazily in the fall breeze. You could have told me you were struggling, I said. With the money, with everything. He laughed bitterly, and looked weak in front of my own daughter. You already did, I said softly, just not in the ways you think. He looked at me, then really looked. It was the first time in years he'd seen me not as an extension of his ego or a reminder of my mother, but as a person. A grown woman. He opened his mouth again, but words didn't come. Instead, his face crumpled, not dramatically, not loudly, but in a quiet, devastating way. The kind of collapse you don't see coming until it's already happened. I felt a surprising ache in my chest, old wounds and new truths tangled together. I'm sorry it ended this way, I said softly. He shook his head. No, this is exactly how everything was always going to end. I just didn't see it. He stood slowly, leaning on the table for support. He looked smaller somehow, like time had finally caught him. Take it all, he whispered. The house, the money, all of it. You've won. I shook my head gently. It wasn't about winning. He didn't believe me. Maybe he never would. He walked toward the double doors, shoulders slumped, steps uneven. As he reached the threshold, he paused and looked back. I loved your mother, he said. I just never knew how to love her the way she deserved, or you. Then he left. Not triumphant. Not angry. Just hollow. And as the doors swung shut behind him, I realized something with surprising clarity. This revenge wasn't a victory. It was a release. A release from years of wondering if I deserved better. A release from carrying his failures as if they were my own. A release from trying to earn love that was never freely given. The truth had done what truth always does, it settled everything one way or another. In the weeks after the hearing, everyone else seemed to move on. People at the diner went back to talking about sales and surgeries. At church, the whispers drifted toward someone else's trouble. Our day in court turned into a story that started with, "Remember that inheritance case," and ended with a shrug. My life didn't shrug it off. I moved into Mom's blue house on Maple Street. For a while, I slept on the couch, staring down the hallway at her closed bedroom door. One night, I stood in that doorway, looked at the quilt she'd sewn, and remembered her saying, "I just want you to have somewhere that's yours." She hadn't fought for this house so it could sit untouched. So I unpacked. I put my lamp on her nightstand. I filled the closet with my clothes. I painted the kitchen cabinets and fixed the wobbly porch step. One cool afternoon, raking leaves under the maple tree, I realized the feeling in my chest wasn't triumph. It was safety. The estate work ended quietly. Mark called to say the last papers were signed and filed. "It's done," he told me. "Your mother's wishes are in place." News about my father reached me in small, awkward updates. Someone mentioned he'd sold his car. Another said his place looked emptier. A woman from church shook her head and muttered, "He's having a hard time," in that tone people use when they're not sure if they're more sorry for the person or for themselves. I didn't ask for more. I'd already spent enough of my life trying to manage his storms. I went home, paid my own bills, and tried to build something steady in the house Mom left me. Then an envelope arrived with his handwriting on it. I stood at the mailbox, thumb under the flap, tempted to drop it straight into the trash. After everything, the lies, the mistress, the way he'd treated my mother's will like a game, what could he possibly say? Still, I carried it inside. At the kitchen table at the seat where Mom used to drink her coffee, I opened it. The letter was short and shaky. He didn't mention the hearing. He didn't blame the judge or my lawyer. He didn't ask for money. He wrote, "I've told myself for years that I was the one who got cheated. The truth is, I failed your mother, and I failed you. Not because you were ungrateful, but because I was too proud to admit I needed help. I see that now. I don't expect you to forgive me. I just don't want to leave this world without saying I know what I did." At the bottom was the name and address of an assisted living facility in the next town. There's a special kind of tired that comes from being hurt by the same person over and over. It sits in your shoulders and in the way you answer the phone. My father had given me plenty of that kind of tired. I didn't owe him a visit, but I owed myself a choice I could live with when I was his age. A week later, on a gray Saturday, I drove to the facility. It was a plain brick building with a flag out front and a narrow strip of grass. Inside, it smelled like cleaner and weak coffee. A TV game show flickered in the common room. A nurse led me down the hall. "Your father talks about you," she said. "In what way?" I asked. "In an I wish I'd done better way," she answered. We stopped at his door. She knocked and opened it. He sat in a recliner by the window, thinner and grayer than I remembered. On the nightstand sat a worn Bible and an old picture of me as a kid holding a fishing pole and grinning like the world was simple. He stared at me. "You came," he said. "I read your letter," I replied. He motioned to the chair near his feet. "Sit if you want." I did. There was no shouting this time, no show to put on. Just the tick of a clock and the low hum of the air conditioner. "I'm not going to pretend I didn't hurt you," he said. "I did. Over and over." "Yes," I said, "you did." He looked at his hands. "I thought if I controlled everything money decisions, what people believed I'd never have to feel small," he said. "Turns out the more I grabbed, the smaller I got." We talked for a while, not about the will or the mistress or the money. We talked about my mother, about the day they brought me home from the hospital, about how scared he'd been when she got sick and how anger had been easier than fear. He didn't excuse himself. He just admitted it. Finally, he looked up, eyes wet. "I can't give you the father you should have had," he said, "or your mother the husband she deserved. All I can say is I know it now, and I'm sorry I made you fight so hard for what should have been yours all along." Part of me wanted him to sit in that shame. Another part wanted to get up and walk out the door. Instead, I took a slow breath. "I won't forget," I said, "and I won't pretend it didn't matter, but I'm tired too. Tired of carrying this. So, I accept your apology, and I forgive you, not because you earned it, because I don't want this to own the rest of my life." He let out a long breath like air escaping slowly from a tire. "Thank you," he whispered. We didn't become close. I visited once a month. Sometimes we talked about ball games or the nurses. Sometimes we just sat in a quiet that for the first time didn't feel dangerous. When he died, it was a simple phone call from the facility one evening while I was making dinner. I hung up, turned off the stove, and walked out to the porch. The maple tree rustled overhead. The house Mom left me stood steady around me. For the first time, I felt grief for my father without anger tangled in it. Just sadness for a man who'd spent most of his life running from himself. If you've stayed with me this far, maybe some part of this sounds familiar. Maybe your inheritance hearing took place in a lawyer's office, a hospital room, or around a kitchen table after a funeral. If my story says anything, I hope it's this. Stand up for what's right. Protect what you've been trusted with. Don't let anyone push you out of your place in your own story. But when the truth has done its work, when the decisions are made and the shouting is over, don't be afraid to set your anger down too. Justice can give you closure. Forgiveness can give you rest. And if this story stirred something in you, if it brought back a memory or a name or a face, take a quiet moment tonight. Think about what you still need to guard, and what you might finally be ready to release. Call someone you've been meaning to call. Share this with a friend who might need to hear it. And if you'd like more stories like this about real life's hard lessons and second chances, you're welcome to come back for the next one. We're all just trying to move through this life with a little more honesty, a little more courage, and a little more peace than we had yesterday.
My thoughts on the story. This story is an emotional bombshell, with unexpected layers that made me stop and think about justice, truth, and hasty human judgments. It revolves around a man, perhaps a young father, who takes his pregnant lover to court, perhaps to fight for custody or a complicated lawsuit. The atmosphere is tense, people around him whisper, judging him as a traitor to his family. Then comes the climactic moment. When the judge reads the DNA test results, his smile disappears, not because of embarrassment, but because a heartbreaking truth is revealed. I picture the scene. His face goes from confidence to shock, then perhaps deep pain, when he discovers that the child is not his, or worse, a family secret is exposed. It's not just a TV courtroom drama, but also touches on the very real fears of betrayal and loss in relationships. I was fascinated by the way the story played with viewers' expectations. Initially, you think he's the typical bad guy, but the final twist completely turned him around, making him a victim of deception. It made me feel sorry for the innocent people caught in the vortex of suspicion, and at the same time, it reminded me of the power of science, like DNA testing, in unraveling the truth. Overall, it was a short but dramatic story, evoking images of life-changing decisions in the blink of an eye, making me want to watch it again to catch all the subtle details. Lessons learned. From this twisted story, I learned a few profound lessons, especially related to trust and the consequences of deception. Don't be so quick to judge others. Everyone in the courtroom, and viewers, concluded he was a bad guy based on appearances, but the truth was much more complicated. Lesson: in life, refrain from judgment. A full story can change everything. This applies to relationships, work, and society, where prejudice often leads to unnecessary hurt. The truth, though painful, is still the best solution. DNA results are the ultimate weapon, clearing up all doubts but also destroying the smile on his face. Lesson: face the truth early, whether through testing, conversation, or evidence. Hiding only makes things worse, and true justice begins with transparency. Trust in a relationship needs a solid foundation. The story highlights the risks of betrayal, but also reminds that sacrifices, like going to court, can be protective. Lesson: build trust through open communication and verification when necessary. If you are in his position, be prepared for surprises, and if you are the one who cheated, think again before everything falls apart.